Welcome back to the second morning session of the Looking Inside Design workshop. This session comprised two presentations. The first from Professor Hélène Frichot of the University of Melbourne, and the second from Professor Lewi, also from the University of Melbourne. The session begins with Professor Frichot's presentation, "What do women do to architectural discourse?"
The Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nation on whose unceded lands I live and work, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And then I want to thank both Philip and Catherine for the kind invitation to come and speak here today in celebration of the really important work of Harriet Edquist and the contributions that Harriet's made to our disciplinary context in architecture and beyond. My first inclination when approached was to speak passionately of the stern care extended by Harriet when I was a fledgling academic coping with a rather toxic workplace, how she created or opened opportunities for me, how she encouraged me, how she shared the space, for instance, at the first conference we co-convened in 2004, Sahans's 21st birthday party dedicated to the theme of limits, followed by a smaller second symposium we ran the second year when I was about to give birth to my first son in 2005, dedicated to the politics of space in the age of terrorism. And in fact, when I was preparing this paper today, I almost forgot yet another event that Harriet supported, which was the 2007 International Association for Philosophy and Literature conference, which was organised across a few institutions and took place at RMIT, and which resulted in a book that Harriet, Elizabeth Grierson and myself edited, dedicated to de-signing design, cartographies of theory and practice. So of course, a Festschrift such as the one we're all collaborating on is a collection that honours a respected scholar such as Harriet in their lifetime. And I was instructed that as the collection would be published in Fabrications, a certain scholarly expectations should be upheld, especially in terms of achieving an international reach with the outcome. So perhaps not about Harriet, but alongside Harriet and her scholarly concerns. But this launched me onto a kind of querulous journey, charting a discontinuous genealogy, episodes of which I want to tell today. These episodes follow alongside Harriet or venture where Harriet is somehow present, even if in the background. I borrow discontinuous genealogy from a former colleague, Michael Spooner, discontinuous because the episodes could be arranged otherwise and might privilege other situated positions. There are many characters who populate the scenes I'm about to venture through. Genealogy after Foucault's Discipline and Punish, after his reading of Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, thereby no grand schemes of history here, but a search for minoritarian undercurrents. What is at stake for me is the loaded question, what do women do to architectural discourse? One thing they might do is contravene the decorum expected in a scholarly context as supported by an institution of higher education and its norms. This might, as Isabelle Stengers and Vinciane Desprez put it, perform the role of women who make a fuss. Stengers and Desprez draw on Virginia Woolf's essay, 3 Guineas, where Woolf asks, why would women enter into institutions that support values that they should perhaps hesitate to accept, calling out instead, think we must think. Stengers and Desprez call themselves the unfaithful daughters of Virginia Woolf in that both of them made institutional careers for themselves. But following Woolf, they want to ask, what do women do to thought? They argue that there are stories that need to be ceaselessly reactivated in order to be relayed with new givens and new unknowns. And what they're after is a sort of reciprocal I'm not going to be able to say this word, catalysis, the effects of which might be induced in the proposition that thought, as we practiced it, we practice as women. What does this proposition arouse? It has been a question that both suggest they've been engaging with around this notion of becoming woman, in the sense of aiming for a transformation of the present. And they call on, in this work, an active experimentation as well as fabulation. And we've heard a little bit already this morning about the role of storytelling when we enter into the archive and reconstruct the stories that might have hidden within and that we might want to remake. Stengers and Dupre also place a stress on the marked category that is woman and urge us to treat this cautiously. They do not assume a homogenous group, and when they venture to glean a collective response to their question, formulated in their own letter of invitation to a number of women in academia, their question, what do women do to thought? They do not expect to receive a reply that will achieve consensus. In fact, the question must be asked again and again, and the answer can contravene decorum, speaking from personal experience, from situated knowledges, partial and fragmentary, necessary and contingent, as Donna Haraway would have it from her early work. Or closer to architecture, perhaps, we could draw on the work of Jane Rendell, who, also after Haraway, discusses the question of situation and argues for the role of feminist auto theory, a practice which invites what can be a querulous, even a complaining, a fussing voice into the hallowed halls of academia. In a series of 5 Jennifer Bloomer workshops that I'm currently convening with Emma Cheetle, the 4th one was last night, the 5th one will be next week, in preparation for a special issue of the Journal of Architecture, Jane has kind of exclaimed, how is it that after 20 or so years, we still think it's so radical to speak from a specific situation, that we still have to argue for making the personal political, that we still have to argue for the position of the voice and about what we want to speak. But Stengers and Dupre make an, okay, wait a minute, sorry, no, so here we have it. This will be the first episode then. So exiting the prelude into the series of episodes that I want to introduce you. And this starting point will journey alongside Harriet in her collaboration with Karen Burns, looking at this specific issue of the Transition Journal from RMIT dedicated to women and architecture from 1988, where I believe they make an important distinction regarding this conjunction, women and architecture, suggesting 2 possible directions forwards, which are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but do suggest something of a gap or a lacuna. There is the project of amending the historical record, filling the gaps and lacunae, writing women back into architecture. And then there is the role of what I would broadly call discourse. What do women do here? Both are feminist projects. Now, reflecting on the role of discourse, they draw on Elizabeth Grosz, and appropriate to our theme today at the nexus of architecture, design and exhibitions. In their editorial, Burns and Edquist refer in fact to 2 exhibitions and or events. One at the once famous George Patton Gallery, a famous site for the production of avant-garde work through the 70s and 80s in Melbourne, and the source for the Grosz piece, which was included in an edited collection by Harriet. The other exhibition at the Monash Museum, University Museum, which Karen and Harriet explain extended the awkwardly framed question, and here it is, that is to ponder the nature of male-female roles and their rightness for the individuals that carry them. And here in the carry, I hear something like gender performance, perhaps, or how one carries off a performance. And so from this awkwardly phrased question, Harriet and Karen argue that most of the exhibitors seem to be ignorant to such works as coming out of French language feminism, including the works of Irigaray, Kristeva, also Elizabeth Grosz, or any other feminist theorist for an answer. So Karen and Harriet are looking to this kind of gap in our capacity for mobilising theoretical discourse. This leads us to a second episode where we can return to the Australian feminist philosopher Elizabeth Grosz and her enduring impact on architectural theory and discourse. We can consider the series of any conferences that ran through the 90s and how these led to Groz's book Architecture from the Outside. And Grosz leads us very directly into the question of feminist theories and practices and how they might be ventured. It's worth noting that Sexual Subversions is published 1 year after the exhibition from which Groz's article is being cited in the Transition Journal in the collection edited by Harriet. And Gros, of course, offers a powerful point of reception of French language feminist theory into the Australian context. But Gros too points out something of a lacunae. She says that these thinkers, here she's featuring Christeva, Irigaray and Michel Lederf, are not setting out, and I quote her, a brief for women's refuges or rape crisis centres. Instead, what they're doing, Gros argues, is unsettling what I might call an onto-epistemological structures, challenging deep assumptions that we have embedded in our ways of knowing, our ways of thinking, and perhaps thereby our ways of performing and practicing. And I want to hold on to this tension that begins to emerge here, a distinction between a pragmatic position and one that takes on discourse in order to experiment with other modes of forward projective movement. But this takes us to episode 3, and we leap forward some years, in fact, and into another geopolitical context, into the Nordic context, specifically to Stockholm, Sweden, where the use of Gros as a conceptual framing supports this edited book by my former colleague Maike Schalk and Ramya Marzay and Therese Christiansson and the graphic designer Mariam Fanny, that is Feminist Futures of Spatial Practice. This is a work that supports very much a projective orientation when it comes to this framing of feminist theories and practices. And it's a large project, you can see from the long list of contributors on the cover, that emerges out of the group that is called FATAL, Feminist Architecture, Theory, Analysis, Laboratory Education, which then institutionalized itself as critical studies in architecture with the collaboration of the late Lena Vilna, Katja Grillner, Maike Schalk, Katarina Bonavia, Brady Burrows, and of course Critical Studies is a research and teaching unit that I directed when I was at Côte d'Or between 2014 and 2019. But again, in thinking with Gros to frame the future that is this openness of becoming that enables divergences from what exists, there is nevertheless embedded in this question of temporality a kind of lacunae, which I've discussed elsewhere in an edited collection called This Thing Called Theory, where in the midst of this radical openness, there's always the propensity to forget what we've learnt in the past. So in this caesura, that we open an atemporal gap according to Gros's particular account of temporality, where we're always at risk of somehow forgetting too much. Now, from this moment, I want to leap backwards again. Oh, not quite yet, nearly. So a further note in this Feminist Futures of Spatial Practice is a collective essay between myself, Juliana and Katja Grillner, where we talk in the midst of feminist theories and practices about the importance of our collaborative companions and colleagues as crucial partners in broader networks of research, and this idea of the value of the mutual support within feminist academic research. But from these moments of the Feminist Futures of Spatial Practice and this collaborative writing venture, we have another sort of launch off point, again, further back into the past. Myself with Juliana and Katja speak of a particular event that took place in Melbourne in 2007, where we were all present, and that is at a Feminism and Architecture Roundtable that was convened at RMIT University between myself and Nikki Carnes, and very much supported by Harriet, and where Harriet was present, as were you know, a large number of people, many of whom we know, you know, from Justine Clark and you know, colleagues such as Anoma Perez and Janet McGaw and so forth at University of Melbourne. Now, at this moment in 2007, something very curious is happening as we're convening to discuss this question of architecture and feminism. And Nikki Carnes, I should note too, with whom I convened this event, is the founding director of XYX Lab at Monash, with its very pragmatic responses to women and vulnerable minorities in the contemporary city. So this is where she shot forward into the future. a reflection on this roundtable, which was held late in the year, was published in Architecture Australia, then edited by Justine Clark. And one of the things that we were struggling with here was exactly how do we kind of reclaim or engage in intellectual culture via theories and practices to open up to new possibilities. We all felt as we sat down together that we'd somehow gotten rusty or had forgotten or lost a language with which to address the pertinent issues. Somehow we had lost hold of something of a discourse that we could sort of mobilize and share together in venturing the question of architecture and feminism. And beyond that even, and we reflect on it in the piece that we publish in Architecture Australia, we're embarrassed to call ourselves feminists at this juncture. We're still embarrassed. Now, I don't want to speak too much about some of these further episodes that follow, because I know I should be drawing to a close, but what I want to address are, and all of these episodes that might follow, including the Writing Around the Kitchen Table event supported by Lorraine Vaughan and Harriet Edquist, as well as a project that happens later that year at the Bartlett, featuring the work of Irigaray, who I've mentioned before, as well as architecture writing experimental practices where Jane Rendell is present in the Swedish context here in 2012, as well as a Daughters of Chaos event that takes place in Sweden in 2015 around the International Deleuze Studies Conference series. And finally, with the 13th International Architectural Humanities Research Association event held at Côte-d'Or in 2016 around the theme of architecture and feminisms. So across these suite of events, what I just want to draw attention to is something that begins to come alive, perhaps in that gap, that rethinks how scholarly research is performed. Across each of these events, we have not only papers presented, but also exhibitions that are mounted and or very lively performative collaborative events, even performing good old consciousness raising moments of sharing, such as the interstitial breakfast that took place here, or else the Salon nightclub that was included with a series of performances and exhibitions that celebrated the 13th International AHRA. So it's something of a rediscovery of a discourse that comes to be performed here, and this is what I want to kind of begin to grapple with, and I'm still struggling to find the best way of describing it, I think. But these are the sort of sequence of events that I want to use to ask the question of what women have done to discourse in the kinds of sharings that take place, how we continue to ask about the adequate theoretical tools and performative tools that can be ventured in these environments, and the continued tension, I also believe, that we see across these between a kind of pragmatic approach that undertakes the important work of counting adequate representation of women in the discipline, as well as the importance of continuing to build the theoretical project that allows us to elaborate on the discourse and the
wrap up
those, and that, yes, so that's basically the final slide, looking for this ever ongoing struggle that we undertake in this process in terms of asking the question of what women do to thought.
Thank you so very much, Hélène. I'll open up the floor to questions if anyone has something they'd like to ask. I mean, I can jump in with a question. This is outside my field, so I may be asking a silly question, but is women the right term to be using when you're clearly positioning it as women who, even if somewhat uncomfortably so, but position themselves as feminists? Do you know what I mean? Like I don't think you're, because of the discontinuous genealogy, it's not so much what do women do to architectural discourse? It's a particular kind of woman, isn't it?
Well, this is where drawing on Saint-Just and Dupré, it's exactly the refusal of characterising a specific kind of woman that they're talking about.
But you have chosen women who are thinking in a particular way, though, haven't you?
Well, in fact, I guess what I'm trying to demonstrate are the diversity of approaches rather, and it's certainly one of the outcomes of the Architecture and Feminisms, Ecologies, Economies, Technologies conference that we held, and why we disseminated the material across not just one location in a book with Routledge, but across 2 further journals, was like holding open the space for a radical diversity of positions. So to constantly be challenging the category, but seeing how we necessarily have to refer back to it. If we can't refer to the kind of crude category of woman, we can't undertake the kind of pragmatic work of such as Jill Mathewson, for instance, who's such an important part of Parlour, of doing the statistics in order to gauge whether women as a crude, broad category are adequately represented. So it's and I think this is also why Saint-Just and Dupré are, you know, they constantly are problematizing what it is that they're doing in asking this question. What is it that women do to thought? And yet realizing that it has to be asked in all its terrible awkwardness and all of the problems that it brings in with it. Oh, Karen's got a question.
Karen, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. If only. Thank you for the paper, Hélène. Fantastic to see all that material brought together. Probably just as a footnote to Catherine's comment, I think it's the provocation, isn't it, where women as a category is an analytic category that's then used to investigate discourse. And I think one of the problems in architecture is that we haven't developed, it hasn't been able to find a purchase in the discipline that there's a sophisticated conversation and understanding of identity and the construction of identity. So we keep having to re-have this discussion about what does women mean, are these, you know, so that's kind of one thing. I would just caution you on your pragmatic / conceptual binary, because it may risk repeating the theory practice binary, which has just been, you know, so central to the way in which the mainstream discipline has defined itself. I mean, another way of framing Jill's work or Nikki's work is that it's research-driven work. So a larger frame that all this work could go in along a continuum is that it's research rather than pragmatism versus, because counting and statistics and digital, especially the construction of statistics by digital means is an area where there has been much discussion and debate and contestation.
I might not have been very clear about this. I'm interested in kind of playing the gap, and it's also why one of the slides includes a special edition of Architectural Theory Review with Isabelle Doucet and myself, where we're very much looking for a speculative pragmatics and drawing on pragmatist philosophy quite directly with that. So I'm purposefully playing the gap, and I'm seeing exactly the threat in it, that it has to be kind of negotiated and traversed, and that relay brought to bear. I mean, that's sort of very central to my own work, absolutely. But we're always at risk of, if we don't mobilise that relationship, we're always at risk of missing out on one side or the other. You know.
Yeah, I think you're going to have to work through it. Otherwise, in the architectural context.
Yeah. No, I totally get it. Yeah.
I think Peter's got a question. Would you like to ask it now, Peter?
Yeah, thanks, Hélène. Always great to hear you. Always expands my tiny pea brain. I think I'm interested, following on what Karen said about that binary between the sort of pragmatic project and a theoretical project. But what strikes me is that other project, which you seem to touch on, and I think that's the performative project. So maybe that binary shouldn't be a binary, maybe it should be a sort of triad or something like that in terms of its conceptual structure, because it seems to me that as a way forward, it's that performative project. And I think I know that you yourself have written about practices and spatial practices across the environmental humanities. To me, in the current context, I think that seems really interesting. And I think even when you go back to the earlier paper on the Boyd exhibition at the SLV, I think in a way we could see that as a different kind of performative project where the text is spatialized and given graphic form. Whereas when you look at the other exhibitions of that time, like particularly Architecture as Idea and also the Classicism one, they're really kind of about the object and boys with toys and, you know, that sort of thing. Whereas I think there's a real, you know, the opening is in the, I suppose, for want of better words, the performative and environmental humanities. So that would be.
No, I totally, I agree. I think the performative aspect that I'm trying to begin to draw out that mounts across those series of episodes becomes stronger and stronger as a sort of, and offers another way of thinking through this question of discourse and how it's performed, certainly, coming at it from a sort of feminist position.
Have we got any other questions for Hélène?
Hélène, can I ask a question? In your paper, what's apparent is, if you like, a chronology of these episodes or events. And I was wondering, has anyone historically documented those yet, or is yours the first time that someone's put it all together to see that cumulative, if you like, development of dialogue and conversation?
Well, I mean, what I definitely want to say here is that it's discontinuous for a reason, because, you know, many of these collaborators whose names are extremely important, who you know, were featured across the series of slides, they would all tell it in a slightly different way. But one place in which part of that telling of the story happens is in the 3-part conversation between Katja Grillner, Juliana Preston and myself, where we recall some of these events in dialogue and speak about how they begin to sort of inform our own research methodologies and approach to the questions that we deem urgent within the domain of architecture. So in a way that was a small attempt, but this is kind of like contemporary history in a way as well. And there's a lot of material. I mean, what happened after the 2016 event in Stockholm was we gathered so much material that we fed our teaching into architecture and gender, you know, for a good period of time into the future. Which has been very powerful.
Now, the reason to ask is I wonder whether there's some use in planning an anniversary event to actually do exactly what your paper, I think, is intending to do, is to, in a way, celebrate the success of the dialogues over a particular time.
Yeah, and of course there are many events that have happened here as part of the incredible contributions that Parla and the original ARC grant through Naomi Stead and that collaborative have made. I mean, there's been a profound sort of blossoming of work here. There was also an event in London that launched simultaneously a whole series of publications bringing gender very centrally back into the history. Into the discussion. I think it was 5 publications launched simultaneously in 2017, I think it was. Yeah.
Can I?
Yes,
please.
I was interested, Hélène, and again, this is going back into my own biography, unfortunately, but that you mentioned, I was really pleased to see Elizabeth Gross so centrally positioned in your paper. That's terrific, because one of the objects that you talk about is a talk she gave at the George Peyton Gallery, and you have brought that gallery, probably for the first time in this context, to the fore. And what it was a lecture series that the George Peyton Gallery under Juliana Engberg commissioned for 3 years. And the one that you quote had these amazing speakers in it, Elizabeth being one of them. And I just think
Spivak even was part of the series, I think, somewhere. No,
who?
Spivak and Umberto
Yes,
Eco.
it was extraordinary. And I think actually, I remember when Spivak came, Karen probably does too, when she came to Melbourne and all the parties and whatever. But anyway, but I do think that when we're talking about sites of agitation for women, I think the George Peyton Gallery, even though it didn't position itself like that, was absolutely one of those sites under Juliana. And that lecture series and the lecture, I mean, she had Echo out and all sorts of people. Actually, that wasn't Juliana.
That was Monash.
Yeah, that's right. But do you agree with me, Karen, that gallery was actually a very important site for, you know, at the same time as transition, of actually a bit earlier, I think, was, you know, it was a generative site for this sort of discussion.
It had a feminist history from the 70s under Kitty Rubo, who was the director. Yeah. But also, I just want to point out that the cover of the Women in Architecture issue that Harriet and I edited is a detail from a Barbara Kruger billboard. And Juliana brought Barbara Kruger to Melbourne, and the billboard was erected, I think, opposite Flinders Street Station. And it was, "We don't need another hero." And the detail was the bulge on the arm and which the little girl was pointing to. And so Dean was really deliberate, and we saw Juliana and Barbara as this fantastic provocation in the public male design space of the city.
Yeah, and so what I totally realized when I was going through transition again was, you know, I could write a paper just about the George Patton Gallery. I could come and talk to you if there was that time, and that would be another paper altogether, actually, which would be really beautiful.
Yeah, hope you do. It brought together some very interesting thinkers, and I think, and this is when you look back at it, you realize how powerful that's been. You don't, at the time, as you say, we are always forgetting. This risk of forgetting. And so what I liked about your paper was actually carefully putting together these episodes that give us a framework for remembering. And yeah.
That's why oral history is so important. A lot of this stuff is locked up in oral history, right, with fragmentary institutional repositories and archival repositories. So, yeah.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you, Hélène, for such a wonderful paper. I'm going to unfortunately move on. Well, not unfortunately, because we've got another wonderful speaker coming up, to move on to Professor Hannah Lewi's presentation. And forgive my terrible French, so I'm probably going to mispronounce this, but is it "What would Malraux make"?
Yep, that'll do.
Cool. I'll hand it over to you, Hannah.
Thanks, Catherine and Philip, for this fantastic day, and to everybody else so far. And look, I was a bit dismayed when this became a Zoom thing, because I think it would be easier to do this little sort of stupid interlude of 15 minutes in person rather than on a Zoom screen, but we'll see how we go. Let me just share my screen. Okay, are we okay? And it's raining very loudly in my cabin, so we'll see how that goes as well. So yeah, as I said, this talk comes with a warning, and it is in some ways therapy after the last year and a half, and is not to be taken seriously at all, and has not got the depth of scholarship of the papers that we've heard so far. Its aim is to playfully and serendipitously explore the imaginative power of archives and the RMIT Design Archive, and to scratch an intellectual itch of, particularly of mine. So I'm borrowing here from Albina Yaniva's book, Crafting History, Archiving and the Quest for Architectural Legacy, that was about the Canadian Centre for Architecture Archive. And she writes about the potential for historical research archives to be understood as sites of the collective imaginary. And her work, along with notable others, reflects a shift in thinking about archives, not just as sources, but to the archive as subject, which has been at work for some 20 years or so. Yaniva asks provocative questions about what an archive might be, which I think have resonance for the RMIT Design Archives into the future, or indeed any archives in Australia seeking to collect architectural documentation. She asks, is an architectural archive a simple depository of documents, or is it a set of discursive rules, a utopian project, a corpus of silence, or confusions? And she, along with others, also have linked the archive with the gesture of designing. And in turn, the likes of Wigley, Frichot, and so on have positioned buildings and places as archives that are a mechanism for storing, classifying, and making historical research available. So therefore, we might see, as Wigley suggests, the entanglement of designing and archiving gestures gaining strength in recent decades and with no sign of waning. Basically then, I took my brief foray into the RMIT archive more as inspiration and provocation for creativity than for serious scholarly work. Confined to lockdown, my chance of interacting with the archive in person faded rapidly a couple of weeks ago. So instead I browsed serendipitously amongst the digital scanned artifacts. But I was determined to engage in some creative physical way and to approach this lovely digital storehouse, as in the words of digital thinker Steve Woolgar, as supplements rather than a substitute for real activities. And I've long been inspired by Mitchell Whitelaw's work that we featured in our book, The Routledge International Handbook of New Digital Practices in the GLAM sector of 2020. Whitelaw creates really poetic, playful and intelligent digital applications that interface with collecting institutions and archives. And in this project called Succession, developed in 2014, he designed an algorithmic program to draw on an archive of around 2,000 images related to the city of Newcastle upon Tyne and its surroundings. And these were harvested from various sources, Flickr Commons, and so on, and they were contributed by institutions across Britain. So reminiscent perhaps of the RMIT Design Archive's relationship to the place of Melbourne and Victoria. In our book, we situated Whitelaw's project in a thematic section that was about animating the archive of particular places. And here we were interested in exploring through innovative cases how new digital projects have been bringing digital archives to life through greater accessibility and new tools and techniques for engagement. Whitelaw intends that these, what he terms fossils, demonstrate how generative techniques can offer prompts for speculative interpretation and imaginative insight, as well as sparks of aesthetic engagement. They provide an interface for investigation of the source materials and of their contexts. So on a Sunday afternoon, in a very clumsy way, I started pretending that I was an algorithm and sort of surfing through the archive and started to play with making fossils of some kind that did nothing but, you know, were fun for me and actually make me look at the archive in a different way. And so I was messing around, and then I sort of started thinking about Hans Holbein's anamorphic memento mori. And again, you know, I'm no good at this stuff, so but I was sort of messing around with anamorphic shapes and so on. So that was kind of fun, and it passed a bit of time. However, it wasn't very satisfying in the end. Enter Andre Malraux. I'd long been fascinated with a now iconic image of the photograph of the writer, art critic, Minister of Cultural Affairs and publisher André Malraux, and what has become known as his Musée Imaginaire, or his book On the Floor. The photographs were taken as part of a series by Maurice Jeannot for Paris Match in 1954. And Walter Graskamp's recent excellent book, published by the Getty Foundation, explores this very same image and has well and truly satisfied my curiosity and more. And there's a good podcast discussion too. The controversial figure of Malraux was captured in a pose of supreme masculine confidence, with what is believed to be the spreads of his new book artfully, casually lying around his feet, when of course the image was staged with great sophistication. At first glance, it may seem that we are witnessing the author working on the final order of images of his book. However, on closer inspection, it became clear that the sequence of the images on the floor was not at all the same as the sequence in the bound volume. And they are facing the wrong way, with half the images in fact face down on the floor, all others appearing upside down to Malraux. A small space is cleared for him in what Graskamp interprets as like a command post or a halo. But in general, there is insufficient space for really making layout decisions. And this is a domestic setting, not a commercial one. We're at his home, not a publishing house. Graskamp notes, clearly, the pages of the book have been arranged with the photographer and the viewer in mind. This is an image not about doing work, but about representing work. So this is a constructed image, obviously, then about the Enlightenment project of ordering knowledge as a museum, an encyclopedia, and so on. It's also about the work of artists mechanically reproduced with no small debt to Walter Benjamin. Via photography of artwork, sculpture, artefacts drawn from many international sources and mostly collected in the Louvre as a locus of French imperial expansion. These works have been described as being liberated by Malraux from their geographical, cultural contexts and constraints and combined at will in what becomes famously characterised by him as his Musée Imaginaire. Graskamp says, it is as though objects enter this imaginary museum by means of technological levitation, which sees stone sculptures, even the weightiest and least mobile, being transplanted into a book of illustrations. So obviously photographs of artefacts were much easier to collect, order and play with than real artefacts in a museum, and much easier to sell and distribute, of course. And the term imaginaire, which originally meant relating to images, was overlaid by another meaning, particularly a poetic one, because Malraux was also a poet, of being in one's mind or not real, which suggests intentionally ambiguous or poetic meanings attributed by him that could be therefore both an imaginary museum and an illusory museum. Also, interestingly, Malraux's first idea was to create an ideal museum filled with photographic reproductions on a scale of 1:1. But this was doomed to failure through technical problems at the time. Graskamp continues about the poetic allure of this metaphor, which I think is very prescient for our inquiry into the creative potentials of digital archives today. He writes, in the wider sense of the term, Musée Imaginaire is a magic formula, the open sesame for a treasure trove that one fills oneself worth anything and everything without ever having to handle a single item, creating combinations that spark off each other and produce completely unexpected ideas. And although the Musée Imaginaire as a conceptual metaphor has been reapplied to the digital archive as facilitated by the internet and mass digitisation, in the context of the mid-20th century, Malraux's Musée Imaginaire should equally be seen as marking out a paradigm shift in the way traditional modes of collecting and intellectualising works of art were perceived and reproduced. With an emphasis now placed on visual comparison through pairs of large format photographic reproductions depicting mostly exotic artefacts collected from Asian and non-Western contexts, learning about art history was reframed as a pedagogical and cultural project that was reliant fundamentally on comparisons. This compare the pair approach was also seen coincidentally through the uptake of illustrated lectures by slide projection in art history education at the time, or at least in the US and the UK. Malraux was thereby characterised as an editor and a curator, a magical collagist, who was playing with reproductions, resemblances and differences in the manner we are very familiar with today. Photographic prints in black and white could now, due to technical innovations, be reproduced and bound in art volumes that were easily accessible. So the images carried meaning and associations, albeit mostly superficial, with little emphasis on accompanying texts or citations. These were now collections of images with short captions rather than images illustrating expositionary text in books. Arguably, the intellectual colonisation of the exotic could be further decontextualised into the bourgeois setting of Malraux as a connoisseur in his European home. Malraux was 53 when this photograph was taken in his salon. I am also 53 with some time on my hands, so I decided to try and recreate this image. This was slightly inspired also by some friends who'd sent me some funny images from London, who also had tried to, they were inspired by this book by Billy Clover that documented Jean Cocteau's photographs of Picasso and mates in Paris. The only connection here to Malraux being that one of the people in this image, Max Jacob, was also a friend of Malraux's. So they went round on a holiday pre-pandemic, trying to locate themselves in these positions. So indeed, Indeed, Malraux's image and the concept of an imaginary museum has been riffed on by artists and photographers, cartoonists, and more. His paper museum drew attention to the floor as a place for exhibiting at a time when plinths were disappearing from sculptures and works were being provocatively staged on the floors of galleries. So you can see here Philip Goldbach's installation in 2013 shows hundreds of old slides, now defunct media, piled on the floor in his work titled Read Only Memory. I was tempted when lockdown finished the other day to get into my office and find the crates of old slides and tip them on the floor, but I digress. There are many others. Tintin goes to Malraux's museum. There's lots of cartoons and so on. We may well say that the screen has well and truly eclipsed both the floor and the book now, and pairs of projected or printed images have been replaced by grids, arrays, scrolls, and databases, affording endless possibilities for comparison and similarity. With textual commentary often fading into the background and via ignorance of scale, provenance, etc., we can create endless resemblances and differences, however superficial. And a fluidity of separation between work and home, as the image depicts, is certainly again with us today, as we work increasingly from our domestic setting in the production and consumption of culture. And as we all carry around now with us these shiny little total domestic museums or imaginary museums in our pockets. So I gathered together images of the archive, printed them out, and I reassembled them in my salon at home, and had my son unwillingly climbing up a ladder photographing me. And then I sort of threw in one with the phone instead of the paper, thinking that that's probably a more accurate way of looking at these sorts of modes of creativity now. So perhaps the ongoing fascination with this image is explained by its prescience, a poetic metaphor for our collective fascination with the image and its inexorable digital slide into the imaginary. Malraux wanted to create a kind of museum that was flexible, endless, more universal, albeit with all the problems and contradictions that this poetic vision entailed then, as it still does now, about image ownership, display, dissemination, and so on. And finally, the original series of photographs of Malraux taken by Junot included other images that have been less well reproduced, like this one, which I found enormously entertaining, of Malraux at the end of the shoot with his jacket off, now reclining on the floor as though he'd now retreated into domestic life again, or what the critic at the time, Amédée Ozenfant, called a musée total à domicile, which translates as an entire museum in one's own home. He's now inhabiting casually his own museum. So I guess there could be more serious things to be said about performative thinking here. But hopefully after this entertaining digression in the day, I returned to Yaniva on the Architectural Archive. Her account of the CCA teases out the problematics and potentials of the archive for architectural history. And an event like this one today and the ensuing publication and the work that will inevitably follow from the ongoing presence of the RMIT archive can also hopefully illustrate the crucial role that archives play in the actual methodologies of historical writing, or what Yaniva calls the fragility and clumsiness of what is called architectural history, and in the actual methodologies of creating representations of our histories that are situated in a place, be they entire cities, on the floor, on the screen, or on an exhibition wall. Thank you. Sorry if that's too long.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That was completely enjoyable. I can see that Hélène has got a question. I'll hand the floor to you, Hélène, to ask Hannah.
Thanks so much, Hannah. That really was totally wonderful. And I think the whole experiments that you're undertaking too, with the whole, well, performativity, interestingly, cuts a sort of thread across both of the papers. But I'm very struck because early on you made a very specific distinction between this kind of creative exploration that's image-based and versus serious scholarly work. And you were very kind of apologetic about what you were showing us. And I just don't really understand why, you know, you wouldn't have been perfectly celebrating it and treating it as seriously in its kind of creative construction. Because again, I was seeing that sort of problematic, perhaps binary or unfortunate distinction coming up between these different modes of research, which I think probably plague our institution in that we haven't managed to get off the ground creative practice at the University of Melbourne because we don't take it seriously. Whereas obviously we see through your work that there are these different modes that offer us other avenues to kind of undertaking both historical work and critical work. So yeah, why would you apologise?
No, I agree. And I have written elsewhere on exactly that topic and forums about research in Australia and how, particularly I think making digital images too, how do we deal with that? So no, I guess it's just, you know, not taking yourself too seriously in that case, but I take very seriously other people's images, as in, you know, Mitchell Weiler's and the book we did, which was really about the book. The Routledge book is very much only talking to designers about the work that they have made and created in the glam sector. So yeah, no, it's.
Hannah, can I ask? I mean, I love the home-based installations, which were fantastic. The original series of photographs of Malraux and all of the images, were they just intended for a book cover, or they appeared? I think you said something about Parry Match.
Yeah, apparently but he was a great self-publicist, and they appeared in a number of places. But there was a profile done him he was a very famous person at the time, and there was an article about him in Parry Match. There was also other images. It wasn't intended for a book. It was intended for publicity.
And
about the book. That then he was mainly at that time, I mean, he did lots of different things, but he was a book publisher and produced these folio works of collecting together works of art.
Because just as a series of photographs in themselves, they are quite extraordinary.
They are, yeah.
Yeah, and can you explain how many were there? Were there, you know, is it an endless?
No, I don't know. I've seen about 5 that are around, and then it's actually quite tricky when you start looking, because they've been copied by other people. And there's one guy who does this still shots, and he looks exactly like Malraux. And then he does this video. It was a sort of dance and kind of opera thing in the 80s. So yeah, but the one I've seen just a small series, and it is only a couple that are mainly in circulation. And then the book, which I don't know if I've got it here, but the book that Grasscamp's done, he mainly focuses on the one image, but then you see at the back these other images, including the reclining one at the end.
So with that in mind, I was wondering, I agree with Hélène. In some respects, it would be great to see this as an exhibition piece of your own, in a way, reflecting on the collection. Anyway, I think it's got endless possibility. Yeah.
And I've got a question for Harriet with this. Because of course the cataloguing and the archiving of the digital images on the Design Archive website, when you were putting that together, was it merely to represent the collection, or were you thinking of these other possibilities that Hannah has showed us today?
No, no, I have to say that it's very pragmatic how the highlights page happens. And it's under the auspices of Simone Rule. She is the person who's been doing that for a number of years now. And generally, it's driven by a couple of things. One is research. So we're putting together now a journal on the really famous graphic designer called Peter Houveniers, who designed the Telecom and the Myer and the Westpac logos and so forth. We've got his whole archive. And because of COVID, the researchers couldn't come in to the archive. So Simone, they requested things and she went down and digitized them and put them up online. Everything she digitizes goes straight up online. So a lot of what you see is actually driven by research about what people are doing. And if Simone digitizes something for an article, whether it's Philip's article or all the people who have written for us, that will go up online. Mm. Then sometimes it's, I think probably that's the main thing, other than sometimes Simone herself gets very enthusiastic about things. And she and Ricky Lee have Ricky Lee, who is in charge of the archive management. And they're very enthusiastic about Weatherhead and Stitt's Jigsaw Factory. It was in Richmond and it was a educational facility that had the conception was formulated by these educational theorists called the Hannon, Lorna and Jeff Hannon. I think it was Jeff Hannon, and it was all designed by Weatherhead and Stitt, and they designed kids toys and games and things, and we've been collecting them, and so they're all up online because they happen to really like that collection. So it's a sort of a combination, and then I might ask them to put something online, but it is actually more often than not research driven.
Mm. So I
was just wondering if I could jump in and actually talk about my process.
Sorry, Simone, I hope I didn't take you in vain
there. No, you were right. But it was just because from watching that, I really enjoyed this talk because for me, there's this sort of a level of curation myself in the way that I put those up online. And so it's partially, I think, I pick the most visually interesting things and tend to put them sort of at the top or in complementary ways to catch people's eyes. But then there's also, I might, sometimes I do things really chronologically. Other times I start to see connections between objects and I start to lay them out together. So I'm doing that actual thing that Hannah's talking about where I'm placing things together through various ways and I'm starting to play with it in a way that I'm hoping that other people then use that as a way to explore the collection when they start going into the website. So I really found this interesting as a talk. It was great.
So I was going to ask a related question. It comes out of Hannah's paper to you, Harriet, and to Simone and perhaps Anne Carew as well. When you did the, I think it was the 10th anniversary issue, and you, in a way, that was an interesting issue because I think you asked a lot of people to select a single image. So do you want to just talk about the whole rationale? Because in a way you were curating an exhibition through a journal.
God, how did that come about? I think that was desperation. Simone, can you remember? I mean, it was...
I do think it was largely your idea, so you'll have to take credit for a lot of it. But I think, the concept was about, we were trying to cover sort of a good chronology of time and as many of the disciplines as possible. but we were also asking people who had connections to the archives to pick something that had some importance to them. So yeah, it was this massively kind of co-curation in a way of where we went and asked people to find something that was important. And so some of their labels, I guess, if you want to use that exhibition term again, some were really personal and some were a lot more academic and historical in the way they wrote them as to why they picked that object. And then I think Harriet and the rest of us all filled in the gaps when we felt like certain areas weren't covered, and sort of went from there. But we were trying to show the breadth of what was in the archives, but also showing the way in which people, I guess, interact, would you say, Harriet, with the archives?
No, that's very well put. I think that's exactly what we were doing. Yeah.
I think also, can I just butt in?
Yeah.
We really also wanted to celebrate the people that had been involved with the archives over that 10-year period. So it was about the collection, but it was also about the community as well.
Yeah.
And there was as
very
well,
important. Yeah.
the British Museum published that book, A History of the World in 100 Objects. So there was this kind of object turn as a way of narrating history that was really important as well. It happened around the first decade of this century. So I think you could connect the RMIT project and Hannah's project to that too. Where the primary focus is on the object, and then there's a kind of history.
Yeah, that model was definitely in my mind.
Yeah.
It was definitely in my mind. That's one of the, in fact, that probably was the model I was using to think about that issue. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been incredibly influential, and it's a fantastic, and it brings curation and history absolutely enfolded together.
Yeah.
Sarah, I'm wondering, because you've just turned your video on, whether you've got a question.
No. I think it was more of the material turn in history, and object history was very much on my mind because that's done and that's what I've led in some ways in terms of doctoral training and things like that for a while. So I suppose I was sort of nodding along, but then I feel as though everything's been said. Yeah.
Yeah. Does anybody else have a question for either the, oh yes, Alex, please.
Oh, and Helen.
Oh, and Helen, I can see you as well. Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Look, Hannah, 7 Steps to Heaven comes to mind in that there is curation, then there is curation, then there's another step of curation, then there's another step, then there's another step, and then there's another step. And I think that's part of the Malraux project, I think. First of all, there is this kind of country or imaginary place which an anthropologist goes to and extracts an object or some data and all that sort of stuff. Not to say nothing of the curation that actually occurs in the place they've gone to in the first place. Okay, then that's taken and put into a museum or into a depository somewhere or other. And you know, when we visit a museum, we don't actually see the museum. We see a kind of a display or whatever, it's up the front, and the rest of it's in huge sheds and warehouses somewhere else. Okay, so there is curation then. Now, then there is this business of putting it into a book, which is what Malraux's project was. It wasn't actually a collection of images on his living room, that's on his floor. That's a sort of a publicity side event, and very amusing and great to pick up and all that sort of stuff. But then there's a book. This book then goes out into I suppose, society as a whole, or into the book reading public or book buying public. And then someone picks up the book and looks through it. I think I had a copy of it when I was a young man. Nice little pocket-sized thing, full of colour reproductions and all that sort of stuff. And then I began a further curation and all that sort of stuff. So there is this kind of range of steps of curation, which might be worth sort of thinking about for this particular project. And goodness knows where it actually stops. We don't quite know where it starts. It's like the turtles all the way down. You don't know where it starts or you don't know where it stops, but certainly there are these kind of steps in the entire procedure. But critical to Malraux's project is this business of the book. And odd, Hannah, that you and I should be talking about books. So it's about this business of the book, and in his case, it's the book as a kind of accessible, democratic, I don't know what other words to use, but you know, a sort of a mass kind of audience that is greater than the museum could ever possibly be. That is, the physical 19th century museum could ever possibly be. And it's the kind of dream that is continued by our electronic media people, who seem to think that Borges's infinite book has been realized by the digital screen and all the information on the internet that it can contain. So there's a range of bits of curation in there, I think. And I suppose the other thing that comes out in your paper or in your project is the business of style, which I fully approve of, really. And that is that all the moves that you make in this should exhibit some kind of stylishness, that is, some kind of elegance and coherence. And I suppose the equivalent of that would be in the academic papers that are written here, where there should be some kind of elegance and beauty in the prose that it is, and the exposition as it is handled and given forth. But certainly, because I'm a visual man, I was deeply attracted to the business of the photos and the collages that you made. Will you make more collages?
Yeah, well, I wanted to get into the archive and get real things and make physical collages, which I do sometimes at home, paint and stuff, but that couldn't happen. So, but absolutely, it is the book he was about, and it was really interesting reading about the revolution in art history publishing through that style of book. Yes. and the prominence of the image over text. I found really interesting.
And I think Helen's got one more question. Am I right, Helen?
Not so much a question as a comment. Thank you so much, Hannah. That was a really beautiful paper. And I loved the expression, I spent the afternoon pretending to be an algorithm. That's going to be my new favourite thing. But it was actually just a comment more on Simone, when Simone was talking about the practice for what becomes that front page, that gallery, that invitation into the archives, and how she was talking about how this is a very user-centric approach, because I mean, one of the key things around archives is who's gatekeeping the information, who's telling us what's important and what's not. But it's really interesting to hear that in the design archives, that's authored through your relationship with your user community, and that's actually a much more democratic process for exploring the archives. So then Simone just curates that in terms of what's going to be the most aesthetically pleasing items at the top of the hierarchy, because you can bring up some wonderfully banal things in a search. And I love the way that they sort of intermesh with others in a way that perhaps Malraux would not like. You'd be editing them out pretty quick. So yeah, I just wanted to comment on, I think that's really a fascinating process, and it was really exciting to hear about it. So thanks.
Yeah, and I agree. And I had more time. I was sort of dreaming of, I took every image from 1967, the year I was born. I took everything that was blue, you know, which is all these algorithms that people have done for galleries and things. So the possibilities were endless. So I thought Alex would like that. So we better stop.
Very quick.
Very quick, Alex.
Malraux, Dada, Surrealism. There's such a connection in the intellectual milieu and the kind of visuality of what they were doing. And in fact, didn't they appear in some of your snaps as well? Some of the people on the periphery of those artistic movements. So you just have to look at Le Corbusier's books, his journals, also the other magazines that come out at the time, how they collage things, how they are nearly all kind of paper museums, if you like.
Yeah.
Anyway, Dada and Surrealism. That's it.
Okay, look, I'm mindful that everybody needs to get a good break over lunch. Thank you so much, Hélène and Hannah. They were just wonderful papers. This is actually an incredible day. So look, I'll say goodbye to you all, and we'll see you back here at 1:30.